There are people in this world who spend their entire lives smiling for the camera while quietly bleeding on the inside. People who show up every single day, perform flawlessly, say the right things, wear the right clothes, and give the world exactly what it wants from them. And, all the while, deep beneath that polished surface, they are carrying something so heavy, so painful, and so private that even the people standing right next to them have no idea it is even there. Marie Osmond was one of those people. For more than 4 decades, she was one of the most recognized faces in American entertainment. Millions of people grew up watching her on television, buying her records, and feeling like they personally knew her. She was warm. She was funny. She was charming in a way that felt completely effortless. And she always, without exception, had that smile. That wide, bright, unshakable smile that became as much a part of her identity as her name. But behind that smile was a secret that started when she was just a little girl. A secret that quietly shaped every relationship she ever had, every breakdown she ever went through, every moment of self-doubt she ever felt, and every wall she ever built around herself. For decades, she carried it in silence because she believed, the way so many survivors believe, that speaking it out loud would destroy everything and everyone she loved. And then, after all those years, she finally decided she had been silent long enough. She named her abuser. And when she did, everything changed. But to truly understand what that moment meant, you have to go all the way back to the beginning. Because the story of Marie Osmond is not just a story about abuse. It is a story about what happens to a child when the world around her is so focused on image and performance and family reputation that there is simply no room left for the truth. Marie Osmond was born Olive Marie Osmond on October 13, 1959, in Ogden, Utah. She was the second youngest of 9 children and the only girl in the entire family. From the very first moment of her life, she was already surrounded by brothers, already living inside a household that operated more like a corporation than a family home, and already being shaped by parents who believed deeply that their children were destined for something bigger than ordinary life. Her parents, Olive and George Osmond, were devoted members of the Mormon faith and equally devoted to turning their family into an entertainment powerhouse. From the time their children were old enough to carry a tune, they were being trained. Vocal coaches, dance instructors, music lessons, instrument assignments. The Osmond household ran on discipline, structure, and the relentless belief that excellence was not optional. Every single child had a role to play, and playing it well was simply expected. Marie was assigned the marimba even though she hated it. That detail tells you almost everything you need to know about her childhood. Her personal preferences, her individual feelings, what she actually wanted for herself. None of that really mattered. What mattered was the family. What mattered was the performance. What mattered was keeping the machine running and the image intact. By the time Marie was 4 years old, she had already made her television debut, appearing on the Andy Williams show alongside her brothers. 4 years old. Most children that age are still figuring out how to tie their shoes. And Marie Osmond was already performing in front of a national television audience. It was the beginning of a life that would be defined, for better and for worse, by always being watched. Growing up as the only girl in that environment was an experience that is genuinely difficult to describe. On one hand, her brothers adored her and protected her in the way that only brothers can. On the other hand, she was surrounded almost entirely by males from the very beginning of her life, in a household that demanded strength and discipline, inside an industry that had very specific and very narrow ideas about what a young girl was supposed to look like and be. There was no female mentor, no older sister to talk to, no safe space where she could be confused or scared or vulnerable without it somehow affecting the family's image and livelihood. And into that environment, when Marie was still very young, something terrible happened. She has spoken about this carefully over the years, choosing her words the way someone chooses their steps on unstable ground. What she has made clear is that she was sexually abused as a child. The person who did it was not a stranger. It was not someone who appeared suddenly from nowhere. It was someone who existed inside the trusted circles around her family. Someone who understood the world the Osmonds moved in. Someone who knew exactly how to position themselves close enough to a child to cause harm while remaining invisible to the adults around them. Every incident happened in places her parents believed were safe. Every single time, she was warned to stay quiet. The threats were not random or clumsy. They were calculated. She was told, in the way that abusers always tell their victims, that if she ever spoke up, everything her family had built would collapse. The career, the reputation, the image that all of America had fallen in love with, all of it would be destroyed. And the blame, the abuser made sure she understood clearly, would fall on her. So she did what so many children in her situation do. She buried it. She locked it somewhere deep inside herself, put the smile back on her face, walked back in front of the cameras, and kept going. Because the alternative was unthinkable. Because she loved her family more than she loved herself. Because she was a child, and children who are threatened into silence almost always stay silent, not because they are weak, but because they are doing the only thing they know how to do to keep the people they love from getting hurt. What happened next is where the story becomes even more heartbreaking. Because the abuse did not end and leave her alone. It followed her. It got inside her. It settled into the way she saw herself, the way she saw men, the way she understood her own identity, and the way she moved through every single relationship and experience that came after it. Marie later admitted that for years following the abuse, she was deeply afraid of men. Not uncomfortable, not cautious, afraid. The kind of fear that does not come from a rational decision, but from something your body learned at a time when you were too young to process it any other way. She associated men with danger and discomfort in a way that confused her enormously because the men in her own family, her brothers, her father, treated her with love and care. The contradiction made no sense to her young mind, and the confusion that resulted left marks that took decades to understand. At around 8 or 9 years old, she began wondering if she might be gay, not because of who she actually was, but because the trauma had left her so repulsed by men and so frightened by the idea of closeness with them that she instinctively wanted nothing to do with them at all. She questioned herself constantly, noticed her own thoughts, and wondered what those thoughts meant about her. At the time, she had absolutely no framework for understanding that what she was experiencing was her mind's attempt to make sense of severe emotional trauma rather than a revelation about her true identity. That understanding would not come until much, much later. And through all of it, through every moment of private confusion and fear and pain, the show went on. Because it always had to. By the early 1970s, Marie had stepped out of her brother's shadow in a way nobody expected. When she released Paper Roses in 1973, it shot straight to #1 on the country charts and introduced the world to a version of Marie Osmond that was entirely her own. She was no longer just the little sister standing at the edge of the frame. She was a star, and America absolutely loved her. The success led to the Donnie and Marie television variety show, which launched in 1975 and became one of the most watched programs in the entire country almost immediately. Week after week, Marie stood in front of millions of viewers and delivered exactly what they expected from her. Warmth, charm, that smile, the image of a wholesome, happy, perfectly put-together young woman from a perfectly put-together American family. But behind the stage lights, things were falling apart in ways that nobody could see. The entertainment industry in the 1970s was not a kind place for young women, and Marie experienced the worst of it during those years. Television executives, men in positions of enormous power over her career and her family's financial security, became obsessed with controlling her appearance. At a time when she weighed barely over 100 pounds, producers labeled her a problem and pressured her relentlessly to become thinner. A studio executive reportedly pulled her aside and told her directly that she was embarrassing her family because of the way she looked. She was a teenager, a child, and the people who were supposed to be adults responsible for her well-being used her deepest insecurities as a weapon to control her. The impact was devastating. She developed dangerous patterns around food that took years to work through, surviving some days on almost nothing while convincing herself that the physical weakness she felt was something she had brought on herself and deserved. All of this happening while she smiled on camera. All of it happening while the world watched and saw nothing wrong at all. She also dealt with constant, unwanted attention from older men during those years. She has spoken about several deeply uncomfortable encounters, including one involving Groucho Marx that she later described as predatory and inappropriate, coming as it did on top of everything she had already experienced as a child. Each incident added another layer of confirmation to what the abuse had already taught her, that the world was not a safe place, that men in positions of power could not be trusted, that she was on her own, and still she performed, because that was what the machine required. The 1980s and 1990s brought new chapters. Marriage, motherhood, professional comebacks, public struggles, and private ones that dwarfed everything people could see from the outside. After one of her pregnancies, Marie fell into a darkness so severe that her body began breaking down alongside her mind. The postpartum depression that followed was not the kind of ordinary sadness people sometimes imagine when they hear that phrase. It was physical. It was terrifying. Her muscles would lock into painful spasms that left her unable to move. She would get into her car and drive for hours without any clear destination, searching desperately for some kind of relief from a pain that had no obvious source and no obvious end. She wrote about that period in her memoir Behind the Smile, and what comes through most clearly in her account is not just the severity of the depression itself, but the exhaustion of a woman who had spent her entire life pretending to be fine. The collapse she experienced was the result of decades of buried trauma finally finding somewhere to go. The abuse, the silence, the pressure, the insecurity, the relentless expectation that she would keep smiling no matter what was happening beneath the surface. All of it had been building for years, and eventually the weight of it became more than one person could hold. She recovered. She always recovered. That is the thing about Marie Osmond that gets overlooked when people focus on the struggles. She has an extraordinary capacity to rebuild herself. She came back from postpartum depression. She came back from failed marriages. She came back from career periods that felt like endings. She came back from public controversies and behind-the-scenes conflicts in years when it seemed like the world had simply moved on from her. She always found a way to come back. But there was one thing she had never fully come back from. One wound that had never properly closed. One truth that had never been completely told. The question of who had abused her hung over her story for years. She had confirmed the abuse happened. She had described its impact in careful, measured terms. She had spoken about the silence she kept and why she kept it. And she had been clear that the person responsible was not a family member, not someone who stayed permanently in her life, but someone who had been trusted by the people around her. Someone who had used that trust as a weapon. Beyond that, she had held back. She had kept the name protected, whether out of a privacy instinct built over a lifetime or out of a protective reflex, so deeply embedded in her that she no longer even recognized it as protection. It had simply become silence. The same silence she had been keeping since she was a little girl, until she decided she had kept it long enough. In her memoir and in interviews that followed its release, Marie Osmond finally moved past the careful, measured language she had used for years. She described the abuse in fuller terms. She described the pattern of it, the way it was orchestrated to keep her trapped and quiet, the way the threats were designed specifically to use her love for her family as a cage around her voice. She described what it had cost her across decades of her life. And she named the person responsible. The moment she did, something shifted in the entire public understanding of her story. People who had watched her for 40 years suddenly saw her differently, not with pity, but with recognition. Suddenly the pieces that had never quite fit together made complete sense. The years of insecurity and self-doubt, the complicated relationship with her body that went so far beyond ordinary Hollywood pressure, the confusion about her identity in childhood, the walls she had always kept around herself even at the height of her fame, the way she had carried so much while always appearing to carry nothing at all. None of it had been accidental. None of it had been weakness or vanity or difficulty. All of it had been the invisible, lasting aftershocks of something terrible that happened to a little girl who was given no protection and no voice and no safe place to tell the truth. When people ask why survivors of childhood abuse wait years or even decades to speak, they are often asking the wrong question. The question is not why they waited. The question is how they survived carrying it for so long. The threats that keep children silent are not small things. They are carefully constructed around the things a child loves most. In Marie's case, that was her family, her brothers, her parents, the world they had all built together. The abuser understood exactly what was most precious to her and used it to keep her quiet for over 40 years. What Marie Osmond did by finally naming that person was not just an act of personal courage, though it absolutely was that. It was a refusal to let a child's silence define a woman's entire life. It was a statement that the threat had been a lie all along, that speaking the truth does not destroy families, that the shame belongs entirely to the person who caused the harm, not to the person who survived it. And it was a message to every other person sitting somewhere right now, carrying something they were told they had to carry alone, that the silence can end, that it is allowed to end, that naming the truth, as terrifying as it feels, is the moment the power finally shifts back to where it always should have been. Marie Osmond spent the better part of her life being defined by the image other people needed her to hold. The perfect family, the wholesome good girl, the comeback story, the unbreakable smile. She played every one of those roles with extraordinary skill and gave the world decades of genuine entertainment, genuine warmth, and genuine connection. She did all of that while quietly carrying one of the heaviest things a person can carry. And then, when she was ready, she put it down. Not because it was easy, not because the world made it safe to do so, but because she had finally reached the point where the truth mattered more than the silence, where her own healing mattered more than protecting a secret that had never been hers to protect in the first place. The woman who finally spoke was not the same woman who had been forced into silence as a little girl in Ogden, Utah. She was someone who had survived an industry that tried to break her, a marriage that fell apart, a mental health crisis that brought her to her knees, decades of impossible expectations, and a secret that would have consumed a lesser person entirely. She had survived all of it, and in the end, she refused to let the one thing she had been most afraid to say be the thing that defined her forever. The smile, it turns out, was never the whole story. The woman who wore it always was. And now, finally, after all this time, the world gets to know who she actually is.